Over 140,000 tons of potatoes from Canada have silently disappeared from the US market in just the past 4 months. No announcements, no explanations. They just vanished. The reason? On April 2nd, Washington unexpectedly slapped a 35% tariff on Canadian potatoes. Fantastic. A bag of potato chips that used to cost $22 now costs $30. A portion of fries at a restaurant that was once $3.50 is now $5.25. And while Americans are paying more for limp fries, Canada's Prime Minister hasn't said a word. He flew off to Asia, shaking hands and signing a $1.6 billion trade deal without looking back. Back home, cold storage facilities sit empty, and farmers are starting to cut production. Customers and restaurants are no longer getting as much on their plates as before. But what needs to be said here is, no one is blocking the potatoes. They're simply pulling out in silence. Because when you slap tariffs on one of your most reliable partners and call it a strategy, don't be surprised when even the potatoes turn their back and pull away. It's also important to remember that before this disappearance of potatoes, this had been one of the most stable trade flows in North America. In 2024 alone, Canada exported about 350,000 tons of potatoes to the US, enough to supply around 17 million American households, especially in the northern states where winters are longer than the election campaigns. It wasn't just trade, it was a culinary habit shared by generations. Minnesota residents eating potatoes from Prince Edward Island is as common as Ottawa residents having Tim Hortons every morning. For decades, the potato route between Canada and the US ran as smoothly as a Tuesday night hockey game. But then came the clever tariff policy. One day, the big player in the White House decided that imposing tariffs on the closest agricultural partner was a way to assert power. No warning, no notice, just a sudden 35% tariff as though potatoes were imports from another planet. According to a July 2025 report from Canada's Department of Agriculture, potato exports to the US dropped by 41% in Q2, the sharpest decline since the 1980s. And no, this wasn't one of those dramatic farewells with crying and tears. It was more like someone quietly packing up and leaving in the night. A departure with no fanfare, yet the consequences are glaring. When you tax potatoes as though they're luxury handbags, something's bound to happen. The US government imposed a 35% tariff on all types of potatoes from Canada. Fresh, frozen, seed potatoes, everything. They said it was to ensure fairness in trade. The problem is, the reality is completely different. Prices soared, shelves emptied, and Idaho potatoes were being criticized for frying up limp, like noodles. Just think about it. A 25-ton container of frozen potatoes that once cost $32,000 now has to carry an additional $11,200 in tariffs. A 35% hike on a food item Americans love more than vegetables and common sense combined. According to the USDA Food Price Index in July 2025, the average price of a serving of fries jumped from $3.50 to $5.25 in just 3 months. This isn't inflation. This is a self-inflicted blow, and restaurants aren't staying out of this either. They're replacing high-quality PEI potatoes with cheaper domestic ones. But don't think all potatoes fry the same. Consumers are beginning to complain because the fries are soggy, the color is off, and the taste is reminiscent of something from a lab. Meanwhile, small restaurants are cutting portions or quietly changing their menus because if they pass all the extra costs on to customers, no one will walk through the door. But here's the crucial point. No one gave Canada a heads up. There were no warnings from the US nor any bilateral discussions. There was no time for preparation or negotiation. It was simply a tariff wall erected in silence. And when the US president builds economic walls like that and turns his back, don't be surprised if the neighbor on the other side decides not to use the front door anymore. In an era of America First, even potatoes are starting to consider applying for a visa. Every time the US raises its tariff barriers, Canada doesn't necessarily have to respond with a counterattack. Sometimes the reaction is just a shrug and a quiet retreat, along with the harvest. Large Canadian processing companies like McCain and Cavendish, giants who once shipped thousands of potato containers to the US every month, have silently reduced contracts with farmers. There were no press releases, no statements, just fewer trucks, shorter contracts, and empty cold storage facilities in Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and Alberta. According to an update from Statistics Canada in July 2025, many medium and small farms have cut back on potato planting by 15 to 25%. not because of natural disasters or pests, but because orders from their largest market, the US, suddenly disappeared. On the other side of the border, the situation is no better. US import companies, now struggling with rising costs, are turning to domestic potatoes, despite the challenges from transportation to quality. A report from the USDA released in July 2025 shows that restaurants in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan are grappling with negative customer feedback. The quality of fries has dropped by 10 to 18%, mainly due to uneven frying, spoilage, and short shelf life. A customer from Eau Claire, Wisconsin bluntly said, "I paid $5 for fries that taste like chewing on a piece of soaked cardboard. I used to go to the restaurant twice a week, now I bring my own food." And he's not the only one. Across the Midwest, fast food chains are seeing a noticeable decline in customers, not because of concerns over calories, but because the quality of fries is no longer what it used to be. A restaurant owner in Duluth lamented, "We didn't choose to change suppliers. It's just that the trucks carrying potatoes from Canada haven't shown up anymore." This happened within a week. Customers noticed quickly and then they didn't come back. While big names like McDonald's and Wendy's still have enough bargaining power due to bulk purchasing, small restaurants and school or hospital cafeterias are the ones suffering the most. A restaurant owner in Fargo shared with the Minneapolis Star, "We used to sell 3 orders of fries for $10, now we barely sell 1.5. Profits haven't dropped, they're simply gone, wiped out." The domino effect is becoming increasingly apparent. From the dust-covered tractors in Prince Edward Island to the confused young workers at drive-through restaurants apologizing to customers for fries that aren't as good as they used to be, it's clear this issue has gone far beyond just imports and exports. One single decision signed in a closed office in Washington has caused a bottleneck throughout the entire food supply chain stretching across 2 countries. When the US chose to impose hefty tariffs, Canada chose to pull out the map and start recalculating its next move. There are no bold statements, no retaliatory tariffs stacked on top of each other. Instead, Canada quietly adjusts its entire potato industry. Processing plants are shifting distribution to the domestic market. Farms are reducing potato exports, switching to smaller 5-kilogram bags for retail, and starting to deliver directly to supermarkets and co-ops. No need for words, just a change in the path of a potato. According to a report from the Canadian Ministry of Agriculture and Agri-Food published in July 2025, the retail price of domestic potatoes has remained stable, ranging from $4.50 to $4.99 per bag, unaffected by the price surges seen in US meats and grains. Excess potatoes have been directly sent to food banks and community kitchens, all done quietly and efficiently. Specifically in New Brunswick and Manitoba, thanks to subsidies, over 12,000 tons of potatoes were redirected to meal support programs for low-income individuals in Q2, according to Food Banks Canada. For an average family in Canada, saving $5 a week on local potatoes can create a significant gap in the budget to purchase essentials like milk, eggs, or bread, everyday necessities. In a time when costs are rising across the board, this is no small matter. It makes the difference between carefully planning every meal and having enough food to feed the entire family. And all of this has been done without fanfare, without pointing fingers, and especially without adopting the victim mentality or seeking sympathy. When your largest buyer decides to tax your goods as though you're selling poison, the most reasonable solution is not to beg them to return, but to find markets that respect you more. And indeed, Canada chose that path. According to information from the Canadian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in July 2025, since late 2024, Ottawa has quietly shifted its agricultural exports away from the US, a market that has become increasingly unpredictable and risky. Canada signed an agricultural deal worth $1.6 billion with Japan, South Korea, and Indonesia in the spring, focusing on processed potatoes and premium frozen foods. The results were swift. In 2024 alone, PEI exported $8 million worth of fresh potatoes to Indonesia, with that figure continuing to rise. Thailand is now Canada's largest potato importer outside the US, with more than $4 million worth of both fresh potatoes and seed potatoes. As for Trinidad and Panama, each country imports more than $13 million worth of Canadian potatoes. This all demonstrates that global consumers are paying attention, and we no longer need to rely on an unpredictable neighbor. What's encouraging is that this success isn't just reflected in sales. It has also opened up a new path. In Charlottetown, a freezing plant signed a supply contract with a distributor in Japan and added a new processing line. As a result, 45 full-time jobs were created and local potato purchases increased by 15%, including those previously considered substandard for livestock feed. It's not about winning or losing, but about recovery and adaptation. Because after the recent tariff blow, Canadians have learned a clear lesson. If you stake your entire business future on a market that changes its face every election cycle, it's like playing a game of hostage poker. Meanwhile, Asia not only welcomes Canada, but has also proactively paved the way by handing over a spare set of keys. However, even with Asia's market wide open and full of potential, the shift isn't as simple as flipping a switch. It sounds appealing, but the logistics are far more complex. According to the July 2025 Export Logistics Report from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, the cold transport system directly from Canada to major hubs in Asia still lacks the capacity to handle large volumes. The cost of shipping potatoes to Tokyo or Jakarta is 20 to 35% higher per ton compared to loading them onto trucks bound for Buffalo. As for South Korea, despite having an FTA, it still hasn't allowed the import of fresh Canadian potatoes due to quarantine regulations. As a result, the most exported product remains processed fries, which are easier to store and are more popular. What about fresh potatoes? They're still waiting at the border. While giants like McCain can manage to set up a logistics system from scratch, smaller farms have fewer options. They can't directly reach foreign customers and remain dependent on large processing plants, who decide which batches go where, when, and at what price. It's true that Canada is making progress, but like any rebuilding effort, it's not easy. The newly opened markets need time to stabilize. Infrastructure is still lacking and requires further investment. Not every farmer has the capacity or connections to negotiate agreements with governments. Opportunities don't knock for long. It sounds good. Expanding markets is always a smart choice, until you realize you're just a small producer standing at the dock, waiting for a ship that only arrives once a month. In the end, no one officially declared war. There were no official statements, no campaigns, just taxes, and a quiet withdrawal. According to data from the World Trade Monitor as of July 2025, Canadian potato exports to the US have dropped by 41.7%, while the total amount of potatoes imported into the US has decreased by nearly 19%. This is all a result of what economists gently call policy friction. But in reality, this isn't just about a few potato containers. It's about trust, because Canada didn't slam the door shut. We simply stopped ringing the bell, and that's what makes people think. Because when your closest partner quietly withdraws without a word of protest, it's not rebellion, it's exhaustion. A summary of the USPA's policy in July 2025 was clear. Short-term protectionist measures might score points during election season, but the long-term impact on reputation is hard to recover from. You can't blame them. If you've been a trusted partner for many years but are pushed aside for political games, you might choose to quietly step back. And you vanish from the game, not with a punch, but simply through empty warehouses, redirected orders, and fries that no longer taste the same. So, what do you think? Will Canada return to the negotiating table? Or is this the quietest farewell in the history of trade between the two countries? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to follow, so the next time someone thinks they can tax trust, you'll be the first to know.